Welcome back to Sleepy Science History. Tell me, have you ever stepped outside on a clear night, tilted your head back, and felt that small shiver of awe at the darkness above you? The stars scatter like dust. The moon glows like a lantern. But have you ever wondered, what if there was more? What if, stretched across the heavens, there were shimmering bands of light, great arcs wrapping the world like a crown? Could you imagine waking every morning to a sky already decorated, as if the universe had painted streaks of silver and pearl just for you? It makes me smile to think about it, and it makes me wonder, what would life be like if Earth had rings like Saturn? Now let's sit with that thought for a moment. Close your eyes if you want to. Picture the horizon at dawn. The sun is just climbing, painting everything in gold. But above, instead of a plain blue ceiling, there's a glowing ribbon stretching from east to west. Not a faint rainbow, not a wisp of cloud, but a permanent archway of light. How would that change the way you feel about home? Wouldn't the world seem somehow more magical? I think it would. And yet, it wouldn't just be pretty. Rings like Saturn would change our history, our science, even our everyday lives. Let's take this slow, like a walk along a quiet path. So how would it work? Rings aren't solid roads in the sky, even though they look like that from far away. They're really made of countless bits, tiny grains of ice, rocky fragments, dusty crystals. Imagine a beach where the sand stretches so wide it feels endless. Saturn's rings are like that, trillions of grains, each one circling the planet, together forming those glowing bands. Now picture Earth dressed in the same jewelry. What would those grains be made of? Ice maybe, rock maybe, shards of ancient moons that wandered too close and were torn apart by gravity. A little violent, isn't it? And yet, strangely poetic. Our planet crowned by the remains of what once circled it. Do you find that haunting or comforting? Let me ask you something more playful. If we had rings, would children grow up tracing them in crayon drawings of the sky, the way they now draw the sun and clouds? Would poets fill their verses not with stars, but with glowing arcs? Would lovers walk under moonlight, but always with those shimmering bridges above them, as if the universe itself had lit candles for their meeting? It's fun to imagine, isn't it? But let's ground ourselves in a little science, gently. Rings around Earth would not hang lazily wherever they pleased. They'd sit in Earth's equatorial plane, like a halo tilted with the planet's rotation. That means where you live would shape how you see them. If you were at the equator, you might look up and see the rings cutting across the sky, bold and brilliant, like a white scar through the heavens. But if you lived near the poles, they'd slip closer to the horizon, maybe even vanish behind the curve of Earth. Would that make northern skies feel lonelier, more bare? Would people migrate south just to sleep under the glowing bands? I imagine early humans would have built their myths around them. Imagine a fire flickering in some ancient cave, shadows dancing, and above, the rings glowing faintly in the dark. Wouldn't they look like a pathway, a stairway for gods to climb, or a river where spirits sailed? Perhaps civilizations would have called them the bridge of the heavens. Maybe they'd believe ancestors crossed it after death. And you, what story would you tell, sitting there in the dark, with that ribbon of light arcing above you? Even today, with all our science, we still love stories more than numbers. But the numbers are fascinating too, if you let them whisper rather than shout. Rings are fragile. They don't last forever. Saturns, dazzling as they are, may fade away in tens of millions of years. If Earth had them, would we know they were temporary? Would scientists warn us that our sky jewelry was slowly raining down, grain by grain, until one day the arc would vanish? How would it feel to live under something so majestic, knowing it was slipping away across centuries? I sometimes think the greatest beauty is found in things that don't last. Don't you? But let's come back to daily life. Imagine walking to school or to work, and never seeing a plain blue sky again. The rings would always be there, changing with the sun, with the weather, with the seasons. At sunrise, they might blush pink and orange. At night, they'd glow silver, reflecting moonlight. On cloudy days, they might be hidden, like a shy friend behind a curtain. Would you take them for granted after a while? Or would you look up every day, Still amazed? I suspect we'd weave them into everything. Calendars might use ring phases instead of moon phases. Festivals might honor the Day of Silver Arcs. Imagine lanterns lit in villages, meant to mirror the glow of the sky. Painters would paint them. Musicians would compose for them. And scientists, you and I, would puzzle over them endlessly, asking, where did they come from? What do they mean? But of course, rings wouldn't just touch our imaginations. They'd shape our planet in quiet ways. You know tides, those daily rhythms of the ocean pulled by the moon's gravity? Rings could add their own subtle tug. Maybe new tidal patterns would emerge, gentle rises and falls no one today has ever seen. Could that change fishing, sailing, even the way coastlines form? Could it spark myths of whispering waters? A sea that breathes not once but twice in strange rhythm with the sky? And what about weather? Rings would reflect sunlight, casting shadows on the earth. Imagine a summer afternoon where the sun is high, but a delicate band of shade stretches across whole regions. Would crops grow differently in those shadowed zones? Would people seek them out like travelers once sought the shade of trees? I find myself smiling at the thought. A farmer standing in his field, watching the pattern of light shift as rings sweep overhead. Not just weather, not just climate, but life itself would bend under those glowing arcs. And what about nights? Picture a world where true darkness never fully falls. Even when the moon is gone, the rings shimmer faintly above. Would humanity fear the night less, comforted by that glow? Maybe fewer campfire stories about monsters in the dark. Maybe more songs about journeys under silver light. Now, here's a question for you. If we lived with such beauty every day, would we still long for the stars? Or would the rings steal the show, making constellations seem small? I wonder if astronomy would even develop the same way. Without deep black skies, would we still notice the faint flicker of distant galaxies? Or would we stay content with the glowing crown above us, never asking what lies beyond? It's a humbling thought, isn't it? That something so beautiful could also keep us from seeing further. Beauty as blessing and as distraction. Let me confess something. As I talk about this, I feel a pang of yearning, as if I almost wish the rings were real. But I also feel a strange gratitude they aren't. Because if they were, our history, our science, maybe even our sense of wonder might have turned out very different. Sometimes what we don't have shapes us as much as what we do. Still, I like to dream. Don't you? Dream of skies that glow. Dream of seas that sway to new rhythms. Dream of myths born from silver arcs. And as I sit here with you, speaking softly, I find myself asking the simplest question of all. What would you feel, standing outside under those rings for the very first time? Would you laugh? Would you cry? Would you whisper thanks? Or simply fall silent? Maybe, in the end, that's the real gift of imagining. Not to know the answers, but to pause, to wonder, to let the question hang in the air like a ribbon of light. So, what if Earth had rings like Saturn? Have you ever thought about how different the world might feel if the night sky was never dark? If instead of a vast emptiness dotted with stars, there were sweeping arches of silver, glowing softly, like brushstrokes left behind by a giant painter? Would you sleep more peacefully under such a ceiling? Or would you lie awake, staring at it until morning, wondering what secrets it held? And here's a thought that lingers like mist. What if the rings not only filled the heavens with beauty, but also guided our earliest steps as humans? Could it be that civilizations would rise sooner, pulled forward by curiosity, their eyes forever fixed not on the stars but on those glowing arcs? I imagine ancient wanderers crossing open plains. Picture them pausing at night, gazing up at the glittering bands stretching from horizon to horizon. Would they see a boundary, a sign that the sky itself had a structure, a kind of roof? Maybe they would feel enclosed, as if the world was not endless but cradled under those radiant rings. Wouldn't that change the way one dreams of distance, of journeys, of gods? Let me ask you something. When you picture the pyramids of Egypt, those perfect triangles rising from the sand, can you see them lit by moonlight and starlight? Now imagine them under a sky with glowing rings. Do you think those same builders would align their monuments not only to the stars but to the arcs above? Could entire temples have been designed to echo the curve of the sky itself, so that standing at the altar, you looked through stone and across heaven's arch in perfect alignment? Wouldn't religion itself bend to match the geometry of the heavens? The rings might have become our first compass. No need for the North Star when glowing bands marked the equator like a celestial path. Travelers, sailors, merchants, would they have used them the way we use maps today, guiding their steps by the angle of the sky? And can you imagine myths? The Greeks told of gods on Mount Olympus. The Norse spoke of a rainbow bridge between worlds. But if rings had spanned the heavens, wouldn't every myth have included them? Perhaps they would be the river of immortals, or the eternal crown of the earth. Children, listening by the fire, might imagine their ancestors sailing upon it, journeying into light. Could those myths have changed our sense of destiny, our hunger for the stars? Let's wonder about art. Would the cave walls of Lascaux and Altamira have shown not just bison and deer, but bands of light across the sky? Would early painters, centuries later, cover ceilings not with golden suns but with arches of glowing dust? The Renaissance gave us Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. What if, instead, it had been a chapel of rings? How would our art museums look today if every painter had grown up with those glowing bands etched into their vision? And music, oh music! Would composers have written symphonies echoing their arc, long sweeping notes that rise and fall like light across a horizon? Perhaps lullabies would have been softer, slower, songs of glowing rivers above the crib. Can you hear it? A faint hum, a whispering tune inspired not by stars, but by an endless crown overhead. But here's a question that makes me pause. Would we have ever seen the stars so clearly? The rings would scatter sunlight, and at night, they would glow faintly with reflected light. Darkness would never be absolute. Would Galileo have noticed the faint shimmer of Jupiter's moons? Would ancient stargazers have charted constellations, or would the arcs drown out those delicate lights? Could we have missed the galaxies, the comets, the endless universe beyond, all because our own sky was already too dazzling? If that's true, then perhaps astronomy itself would have been delayed. Maybe telescopes would have been turned first upon the rings, not the stars. Maybe instead of discovering the vast cosmos early, humanity would have been absorbed in studying its own glowing crown. Imagine entire centuries spent just mapping the arcs, measuring their tilt, charting their shadows, never realizing how many stars were hidden behind them. Doesn't that send a shiver through you? The idea that we might never have learned how small Earth truly is, because our own sky kept us distracted? And then there's science in another sense, the quiet rhythms of Earth itself. Rings are not silent. They pull, they tug, they cast shadows. Imagine the equator lying beneath their permanent shade. Tropical lands might not be lush jungles, but cooler, dappled forests. Their weather shaped by shadows cast across centuries. Would the Amazon even exist? Would deserts spread wider, or shrink beneath the shade? I picture farmers watching the sky not just for rain clouds, but for the angle of the glowing bands. Perhaps they'd whisper, "This season will be gentle. The rings are shading the sun." Crops, climates, harvests, all changed by that arc of dust and ice. Our very survival might have been written by the glow above. And then the oceans, always listening, always obeying. Rings would have pulled on tides with a delicate hand. Maybe strange rhythms would emerge. Smaller waves lapping gently in some places, or mighty surges in others, shaped not only by the moon but by bands of circling fragments. Could entire coastlines look different? Could ancient fishermen have told stories of tides that rose not once but twice, whispering that the sea was breathing with the rings? If the sea is life's cradle, then rings might have been its lullaby. Perhaps they would have guided evolution itself, shaping where creatures swam, where they crawled ashore, where humans built their first villages. Wouldn't that be extraordinary, to think the arc above might decide the rhythm of life below? And what about us, sitting here in our imagined present? If Earth had rings today, would you live your life differently? Would city skylines be built to frame them? Skyscrapers reaching not just upward, but angled to catch their glow? Would architects plan balconies where you could sip coffee at dawn while watching silver light ripple across the heavens? Even your phone wallpaper, what would it be? Not stars, not galaxies, but the rings of home. Imagine social media filled with endless photos, sunrise through the arcs, wedding under the rings. The glow from my window tonight, it would be the backdrop of every memory, the frame around every photograph. Wouldn't that shape our very sense of beauty? And speaking of beauty, let's pause on love. How many songs about moonlight would instead be songs about ring light? Lovers sitting together might not say, "Look at the stars." They'd say, "Look at the crown of the earth." Wouldn't proposals happen beneath them? Vows exchanged in their glow? Could entire traditions form around the arcs? Holidays, dances, anniversaries tied not to dates but to the shifting shimmer of the rings? Yet, I wonder, would we ever long for darkness? Would artists ever cry out for a plain sky, a blank canvas unmarked by light? Perhaps some would journey to the poles, where the arcs slip below the horizon, just to feel what it's like to look into blackness unbroken. Would darkness itself become exotic, rare, a luxury sought by poets and dreamers? Now let's wander into another question. If Earth had rings, would we ever feel the same need to leave? Part of why we reach for the stars is because the night sky feels empty, and we long to fill it. But if our sky was already adorned, would space travel feel urgent? Would we even think of leaving? Or would we say, "The heavens have already given us their crown. What more could we want?" Perhaps Apollo missions would never have happened. Perhaps no Voyager probes, no space telescopes, no astronauts walking on other worlds. Isn't that both comforting and tragic at the same time? But then again, maybe the opposite. Maybe the rings would ignite even deeper curiosity. Imagine scientists wondering, if Earth has these arcs, do other planets have greater wonders? Maybe we'd race into space sooner, eager to compare, to search, to gather stories from every glowing crown. Could the rings have sparked exploration centuries earlier, setting sail not across oceans but across the void? And here's a last thought, quiet but persistent. Rings do not last forever. They fade, they fall, they rain down on the planet grain by grain. What if Earth once had them, and lost them? What if ancient myths of heavenly bridges or silver rivers are echoes of memories passed down from a time when the arcs still hung above us? Could that explain why so many cultures speak of pathways in the sky? Could humanity carry, deep in its bones, a memory of rings that once were? If so, then we are not imagining what might be, but remembering what has been. Doesn't that make you pause, just for a heartbeat, to wonder whether the stories we tell are not inventions but fragments of truth? So here we are, left with the question. If Earth had rings, would we be wiser, kinder, more curious? Or would we be blinded by their beauty? Maybe the answer is not to know. Maybe it is enough to sit quietly, to let the question hum in our minds, like the soft glow of light above the horizon. Have you ever wondered what shadows would look like if the sky itself carried its own pattern? What if daylight was never just the plain sweep of the sun, but always filtered through arcs of light and shade? Can you picture a noonday field, not simply bright but crossed by delicate silver streaks cast from rings above, like sunlight through a stained glass window? Wouldn't even the ordinary feel enchanted, as if the whole earth were walking forever beneath cathedral ceilings? Imagine standing at the equator. The rings would cut across the heavens, steady and brilliant, like an eternal bridge. When the sun rose, its light would pierce through them, splitting into beams, scattering across the ground. Do you think we'd mark time not just by the hour or the season, but by the angle of those beams? Could shadows have become the earliest clocks, far more precise than sundials, carved by the geometry of heaven itself? And how would our sense of direction change? Today, the stars are our compass. But if glowing arcs framed the sky, always marking the equator, wouldn't they guide every traveler? Would explorers have walked with confidence, knowing the sky was a permanent map? Could entire cultures have been spared the terror of being lost, because the heavens always pointed them home? Here's something else to wonder. What would a storm look like beneath the rings? Thunderheads swelling tall, lightning flashing, but above them, the arcs still glowing faintly, untouched, eternal. Would storms feel smaller, less frightening because the sky still wore its crown? Or would the contrast make them seem even wilder, chaos raging beneath order? And rainbows, what of them? Today they are rare gifts, arches of color after rain. But if rings crossed the sky every day, wouldn't rainbows seem like little echoes, smaller cousins of the great arc? Would they lose their magic? Or would we see them as whispers of the larger wonder above? Now imagine winter. Snow falling under rings that glow pale silver, turning fields into glittering mirrors. Would children grow up sledding not just under the sun, but under a ceiling of light? Could the rings even glow brighter against the snow, making nights feel more like twilight than darkness? Perhaps polar nights, endless and cold, would never be truly black at all, softened by the faint shimmer overhead. And then summer. Long days where the rings reflected sunlight so strongly they seemed to blaze, a permanent streak of fire. Could farmers have called it the burning crown? Would it be feared, as if heaven itself might ignite? Or would it be celebrated, honored as the source of ripening harvests? You see, rings would not simply be decoration. They would weave themselves into every rhythm of life, every ritual. Think of festivals. What holidays would humanity invent to honor the glow overhead? Perhaps the day the rings cast their longest shadow would be celebrated as the crown's night. Entire cities might gather, lanterns in hand, singing beneath the brightest glow. Wouldn't that leave a mark deeper than any calendar date we now keep? And think of architecture. Would we have built homes differently, always facing the arcs? Imagine entire towns aligned to capture their shimmer at dusk. Imagine grand amphitheaters where performances began only when the rings were glowing brightest. Could the Parthenon or the Colosseum have been angled differently, not toward the rising sun but toward the heavenly crown? I sometimes picture skyscrapers today, glass towers reaching upward. But if rings existed, wouldn't they be designed like prisms, bending the arcs into rainbows? Cities might glitter with refracted light, glowing silver even at night. Could urban skylines resemble living jewelry, reflecting the sky's crown endlessly? And then, there is the human heart. You and I both know how much meaning we place in the heavens. Lovers today already speak of stars, of moons, of galaxies. But if rings hung overhead, would vows always mention them? I will love you as long as the rings glow. Doesn't that feel different, heavier, more eternal? But here's another question. Would we ever tire of them? Would children roll their eyes at adults who wax poetic about arcs they see every day? Would the extraordinary become ordinary, so woven into daily life that we forget to look up? Or do you think the rings would always keep their spell, no matter how many centuries passed? Let's stretch further. Imagine spaceflight, rockets rising upward, punching through the atmosphere. But instead of climbing into blackness, they would pierce through the bands themselves. Could you imagine that sight from a window? A spacecraft streaking through a glittering ocean of dust and ice? Would astronauts describe it like flying through a frozen rainbow, or like brushing fingertips against the threads of a cosmic harp? And satellites. Today, they circle Earth in quiet darkness. But with rings, many orbits would be crowded, dangerous, tangled with fragments. Would space programs have begun at all, knowing the sky was filled with debris? Or would the challenge have inspired us earlier, to leap into engineering solutions centuries before we truly did? And here is a darker thought. What of meteors? Earth already collects dust from space, burning it bright across the night. But if we had rings, wouldn't fragments rain down more often? Could humanity have grown up under constant streaks of fire, shooting stars not as rare wishes but nightly occurrences? Would that make them less magical, or would we find new meaning in them? Picture ancient storytellers pointing to the arcs and saying, "The gods are shedding sparks again." Wouldn't entire mythologies be built on such fiery showers? But even beauty can be fragile. Rings do not last forever. Slowly, particle by particle, they fall, pulled down by gravity, by atmosphere, by the planet they circle. If Earth had rings, could humanity live with the knowledge that they were fading? Would generations grow up seeing them dim year by year? Would poets mourn, writing of a sky once crowned and now bare? And if that happened, how would it change us? Would we remember them as a golden age, forever yearning for their return? Would art and religion revolve around loss, around absence? Could entire cultures define themselves not by what is above them, but by what has vanished? But let's not leave ourselves only with sadness. Imagine instead the opposite. Imagine we live in a time when rings are just beginning to form, a moon breaking apart, dust and ice spreading, slowly becoming arcs. Can you picture humanity watching the sky change? At first faint, a thin band, barely noticeable, then brighter each decade, until whole generations know nothing but its glow. Wouldn't that be a collective miracle, something no myth could ever match? And here is another wondering. If rings had been with us since the beginning, would we think of them as natural or divine? Would science ever truly strip them of mystery, or would they always feel like a gift? Even now, with all our telescopes and equations, Saturn's rings feel a little like magic, don't they? Wouldn't Earth's feel the same, no matter how much we explain them? I think of children, small hands pointing upward, eyes wide, asking their parents, "Why does the sky wear a crown?" And perhaps the answer would always be the same, because Earth is special. Wouldn't that belief sink deep into the human spirit, that our home is not ordinary, but chosen, adorned? And yet, isn't that what we already feel, in our quietest moments? That Earth, with or without rings, is astonishing, rare, almost impossibly beautiful. Perhaps the rings are only a mirror of what is already true. Still, I like to imagine the sound of life under them. Cities buzzing, oceans breathing, forests whispering, all beneath arcs of light. Wouldn't every sound carry a little more weight, a little more meaning, under a sky that glittered even at night? So let me ask you, if you stepped outside tonight and saw them, stretching from horizon to horizon, how would you feel? Would you cheer, laugh, cry, fall silent? Would you call someone to see them, or keep the moment to yourself like a secret treasure? Maybe, in the end, the question is not just what if Earth had rings like Saturn, but how would we change because of them? Would we be wiser, more humble, or simply more distracted, gazing upward while the world below keeps turning? I don't know, and maybe that's the point. Some questions are not meant to be answered, only asked, again and again, like a soft echo under a silver sky. Have you ever thought about how differently humans might see themselves if the sky always carried a crown? If every time you looked upward, there was proof that the Earth itself wore jewelry radiant and permanent? Would we walk with more pride, knowing our planet was adorned? Or would we bow our heads in humility, feeling small beneath so much beauty? Think about a child growing up under that sky. What would their first memory of wonder be? The rings glowing at sunset? A silver arc cutting through dawn? Would their questions be louder, more urgent? Why does the sky look like that? Who put those there? And would the answers given by parents shape entire worldviews? Perhaps one family would say, "It's a gift from the gods." Another might whisper, "It's the bones of a broken moon." Which story would you carry in your heart? And isn't it strange how something above us could decide how we see ourselves below? Let's imagine early civilizations again, but this time not just their temples or monuments. Think of their rulers. A king standing before his people, gesturing at the arcs overhead. Wouldn't it be tempting to claim them as symbols of power? To say, "These rings shine because I am chosen"? Could crowns themselves, those circles of gold on royal heads, have been inspired not by the sun or halo, but by the arcs of the earth? Do you think coronations would have felt less like pageantry and more like reflection, a human echo of the planet's own crown? And what of religion? Would priests have spoken not of heaven above the stars, but heaven lying just at the edge of the arcs? Might the rings have been described as gateways, thresholds between the mortal and the divine? If so, every prayer, every ritual, every funeral might have been directed not to distant constellations, but to the glowing bridge overhead. Wouldn't that have reshaped the entire story of humanity's faith? Here's another question. What if the rings had colors? Saturn's are pale, icy, mostly silver and cream. But imagine if Earth's carried shades of gold, or faint emerald, or sapphire blues reflecting oceans below. Can you picture them? A rainbow frozen in place, spanning the sky forever. Would art have been less desperate for color, less hungry for pigments, if the heavens already provided it? Would painters still have ground minerals into powder, still searched for lapis lazuli and ochre, if they only had to look upward for inspiration? And music, too. How would it sound if every festival, every choir, every chant echoed beneath glowing bands? Would human voices lift differently, trying to match the sweep of those arcs? Maybe whole instruments would have been invented just to capture their imagined hum. A harp strung like the rings, notes rippling out like glimmers of light. Could the very idea of harmony, the blending of many voices, have been born from seeing countless fragments forming one glowing arc? And then there is language. So many of our words today come from the heavens. Lunatic, stellar, eclipse. What new words would rings have given us? Perhaps crowned would mean not royalty, but blessing. Perhaps under the arc would mean safety, like being sheltered by heaven itself. Could sayings, proverbs, even lullabies have been woven with that imagery? Can you hear a mother whispering, "Sleep, my child, beneath the silver crown"? Now let's think about navigation again. Rings marking the equator would mean permanent guidance. Sailors would look upward, not searching for stars but for arcs. Wouldn't that make exploration easier? Could humanity have crossed oceans centuries earlier, guided by the crown of the earth? Entire continents discovered not in accidents of wind, but by deliberate journeys under the arcs. Could history itself have unfolded faster, simply because the sky offered a map that never shifted? And yet, would that certainty also limit us? If the rings always pointed the way, would we still hunger for mystery? Or would the world feel too ordered, too explained, robbing us of the thrill of the unknown? Picture a philosopher standing in Athens, staring upward. Instead of asking, "What are the stars made of?" maybe he asks, "Why does the crown shine?" Would science have taken a different path? Centuries of thought aimed not at atoms or galaxies, but at the fragments above. Could entire philosophies have risen and fallen around them? And then politics. Rings would not look the same everywhere. At the equator, they'd blaze across the sky, unmistakable. But near the poles, they might fade, even disappear below the horizon. Would that divide humanity? Equatorial peoples seeing themselves as blessed, northern ones longing for a crown they could not see? Could wars have been fought over who truly lived under the arc? Would nations at the equator have claimed superiority, saying the gods had chosen them, while those at the edges felt abandoned? Isn't it remarkable how something as silent as dust and ice could stir so much drama among us? Now imagine eclipses. Today, they are rare and extraordinary. Moons covering suns, shadows racing across Earth. But if we had rings, wouldn't eclipses be more complex? The sun peeking through arcs, creating shimmering bands of shadow, like fingers of light playing across the land. Can you picture people centuries ago dropping to their knees, convinced heaven itself was speaking in light and dark? Would scientists today study them with even more passion, using eclipses not just to measure the sun but to decode the mystery of the crown? And let's not forget, rings change. Their angle shifts with seasons, sometimes brighter, sometimes dimmer, depending on where Earth is in its orbit. Could entire calendars have been built on their rhythm? Farmers marking planting not by stars but by the glow of the crown. Priests declaring holy days when arcs shone brightest. Could time itself have been measured differently, humanity's whole sense of order tied to light from above? Do you think we'd still invent clocks? Or would we measure hours by the shimmer of the arcs, slower, gentler, never needing gears and bells? And here's something quieter. How would ordinary people live with such beauty? Imagine lovers walking at night, not beneath stars but under arcs glowing softly. Would they hold hands differently, slower, speaking less, because the sky already spoke for them? Would poets write endlessly of it, or would they fall silent, overwhelmed, unable to capture what their eyes already saw every night? And children. I think of children most of all. Their drawings would always include the crown. Their stories, their games, their make-believe adventures, always under arcs of silver. Could childhood itself feel different, more magical, more secure, if the sky looked dressed for a celebration every day? And yet, maybe it would bring fear too. If the rings faded, dimmed, shifted, would children worry the world was losing its crown? Could fear of a sky without arcs become a universal dread, passed from generation to generation? Here's a darker question. If the rings were fragile, and a comet or asteroid shattered them, would we survive the rain of fragments? Could entire civilizations be erased beneath fiery showers? Might myths of floods, fires, or falling stars all be echoes of such catastrophes? Would humanity rise again afterward, telling stories of the crown that once was? Or imagine the opposite, that the rings grew brighter, dust pulled in, fragments multiplying? Would people rejoice or panic? Would prophets declare it a sign of change, of doom, of rebirth? So many questions. And yet, beneath all of them, one thought lingers. If Earth had rings, our sense of home would be different. We would not think of Earth as plain, small, fragile. We would think of it as adorned, crowned, chosen. Wouldn't that shift our entire identity as a species? Instead of gazing outward, wondering if we were special, we might gaze upward, convinced that we already were. But would that make us humbler or prouder? Gentler or more arrogant? I don't know. And maybe the answer lies not in imagining certainty, but in dwelling in the mystery. To sit quietly, as you are now, picturing a world under silver arcs, asking not what is true, but what could be. And maybe that's enough. Have you ever thought about how fragile the balance of sunlight is on Earth? How just the right amount warms our oceans, grows our crops, and lights our days? Now imagine if that balance was filtered through rings. If sunlight never reached us plain and unbroken, but instead slipped between arcs of dust and ice, painting the Earth in shifting ribbons of shadow. Would our world be softer, cooler? Would whole regions live under permanent twilight? Picture it, you're standing in a field at noon. The sun is high, but the light is not sharp. Instead, delicate shadows stretch across the land, like the bars of an invisible harp. Birds glide through them, wings flashing bright then dim, as if the air itself is layered. Would farmers learn to plant differently in those shadow stripes, choosing crops that flourish in the filtered light? Would whole cuisines taste different, born from harvests shaped by the arcs above? And what about seasons? Today they shift with Earth's tilt, bringing cycles of warmth and cold. But if rings stood across the sky, they would cast their own seasonal patterns. During certain times of the year, sunlight might be softened at the equator, while in others, long shadows might creep across continents. Could spring feel less like a surge of warmth and more like a gentle unveiling, the crown slowly lifting its veil from the land? And winters, can you imagine? Snow falling under permanent arcs, the rings catching sunlight and reflecting it even into the longest nights. Would darkness ever truly rule, or would faint silver always linger, softening the harshness of cold? Here's something else to wonder. What would clouds look like under such skies? We already marvel at the way they catch sunsets, glowing pink, orange, and purple. But if rings stretched across the heavens, scattering sunlight, wouldn't clouds become canvases of even stranger colors? Can you picture a thunderhead glowing with streaks of violet as sunlight ricochets off icy arcs? Or thin cirrus clouds lit from below by the faint glow of ring light, like feathers dipped in pearl? Would weather forecasts even make sense? Tomorrow, scattered showers, ring shadows at dawn, glowing skies by dusk. Could weathermen talk of the arcs the way they now talk of cold fronts? And what of the oceans? The tides already dance to the pull of the moon, rising and falling as if breathing with the heavens. But rings, massive bands of matter orbiting Earth, would tug as well. Perhaps tides would split into stranger rhythms, not just one rise and fall, but a subtle extra pulse, a second heartbeat hidden in the sea. Would fishermen tell stories of these whisper tides, quiet surges that came not from the moon but from the crown of the sky? Would sailors plan journeys not just by moonlight but by ring light, waiting for the sea to answer the arcs above? And the creatures of the ocean, how would they change? Coral reefs, delicate as lace, respond to moonlight cycles. Sea turtles crawl ashore guided by glimmers from above. If rings shone silver every night, wouldn't life adapt? Perhaps fish would glow differently, mimicking the arcs. Perhaps birds would migrate by their light instead of the stars. Entire ecosystems could evolve to answer the crown, tuned not just to sun and moon but to a third permanent rhythm. Have you thought about the poles? They already carry their own magic. The auroras, curtains of green and red dancing in the sky. But under rings, imagine the sight. Arcs of silver stretching across the heavens while ribbons of light flicker beneath them. Wouldn't the sky look alive, layered in wonder? Could myths be born not just of gods, but of battles between glowing crowns and shimmering veils? And here's another question, what of deserts? Harsh, sun-blasted, unforgiving. If rings cast shade, would deserts shrink? Could once barren lands bloom under softer skies? Or would the arcs reflect heat unevenly, creating stranger deserts in new places, pockets of burning heat framed by the cool glow of shade? Would nomads tell stories of the shadows of the crown, oases hidden in places where ringlight touched the earth? It makes me wonder, would human migration follow those patterns? Would civilizations cluster in regions where ring shadows cooled the land, or in places where their light glowed brightest? Could whole empires rise not by rivers or seas, but under the most brilliant arcs of the crown? Think of agriculture again. Wheat, rice, corn, all born under our current skies. But under rings, would we have grown different staples? Perhaps plants that thrive in filtered light, leaves broader, flowers paler. Would vineyards grow grapes infused with silver hues, wines tasting faintly of the heavens? Would poets raise cups and call it the drink of the crown? And what of animals? Creatures evolve under light and dark, their rhythms tied to day and night. But if ring light softened every night, would nocturnal life exist the same way? Would bats still soar, owls still hunt, if true darkness never came? Or would a gentler twilight spawn entirely new species, half-night creatures, thriving in the dim glow of arcs? Would fireflies exist? Or would their tiny lanterns be lost against the permanent glow? And here is a playful thought, what would sleep feel like? Humans need darkness, true rest. If rings glowed every night, would our ancestors have slept less, awake under the silver crown? Would circadian rhythms be different? Could our very bodies, our brains, have evolved to handle twilight instead of night? Might we live slower lives, less driven by the push of day and night, more lulled by a constant half-light? Do you think dreams themselves would change? Imagine lying down as a child, rings glowing above, their shimmer slipping through windows. Wouldn't your dreams be filled with arcs and bridges, stairways into the sky? Could humanity have grown up more dreamlike, more poetic, because every night looked like a story waiting to be told? But rings would not just touch hearts, they would test survival. Shadows across continents could shift climate. Crops might fail in places, flourish in others. Entire wars might be fought not for land itself, but for the glow above it. Nations claiming, our fields are touched by the brightest crown. Would politics be more fierce or more united under such a sky? And then, think of science again. Rings are fragile, temporary. Saturns may one day vanish, raining down into the planet. If Earth had them, would our ancestors have known they were fleeting? Would scientists warn us, even today, that the crown of the Earth was disappearing, grain by grain? How would we react? Would people mourn? Would religions claim the fading arcs as a sign of ending times? Would artists rush to paint, to sing, to capture the glow before it was gone? And what of children born after they faded? Imagine a generation growing up under bare skies, listening to parents whisper, once there was a crown. Wouldn't they ache for something they never saw? Could humanity itself carry a permanent longing, an ache for a sky that once was? But let me ask something gentler. What if, instead, the rings were growing? Imagine scientists today watching as the arcs grew brighter, wider, more dazzling each decade. Wouldn't the world unite in awe? Would there be festivals, countdowns, celebrations as each new year brought a more brilliant crown? Would we feel blessed, chosen, special? Or would we fear, whispering that too much beauty must mean something terrible waits ahead? There is a balance in everything. Light and shadow, creation and loss. Rings, if they were ours, would test that balance constantly. They would remind us that Earth is not just a rock circling the sun, but a stage where dust and ice, light and shadow, weave their own story. And maybe that's what I love most about imagining them. Not the science alone, not the myths or the art, but the way they tie everything together. They would shape tides and crops, but also lullabies and poems. They would cool deserts, guide sailors, inspire lovers. They would make our world both stranger and more beautiful, harsher and more gentle. And you, how do you think you would live under them? Would you rise early each day just to watch their glow at dawn? Would you write stories about them or sing songs or simply sit in silence beneath them? Would they make you feel more alive or more dreamlike, caught forever in twilight? Maybe, in the end, that's the question the rings ask. Not what they would do to the Earth, but what they would do to us. Would we become more practical, reshaping our world to fit their patterns? Or would we become more poetic, always gazing upward, letting the arcs remind us of mystery? Perhaps both. Perhaps that's the gift of the crown. To hold us in balance, like Earth itself balanced in space, spinning beneath arcs of dust and light. And maybe, just maybe, that's all we need to imagine, to wonder, to let the question itself glow like a ring around the mind. Have you ever stopped to think how differently time might feel if the sky itself carried a rhythm? Not just the rising and setting of the sun, not just the phases of the moon, but a permanent crown above, shifting with the seasons, glowing brighter at certain times of the year, dimmer at others. Wouldn't time itself feel thicker, layered, as if every day carried two clocks, one on Earth, one in the heavens? Imagine people sitting around a fire thousands of years ago. The rings arch across the night like silver ribbons. Someone notices they change with the seasons, the tilt of the Earth revealing new angles, brighter arcs, darker shadows. Could that have been our first calendar? Instead of carving marks on bones or following the stars, perhaps we would have simply lifted our eyes, reading time in the shimmer of the crown. Would entire cultures have measured their years not in moons but in arcs, speaking not of January or June but of the bright crown and the dim crown? And think of rituals. Today we gather for solstices, equinoxes, eclipses. But if rings lit the sky, wouldn't we celebrate the moment they glowed most brilliantly? Would there be sacred festivals under the high crown, when arcs blazed brightest, showering the land with reflected light? Entire cities might dance, sing, pray beneath them, believing heaven itself was closest at that moment. Here's another thought: how would memory work under such skies? When people told stories, would they say, "It was under the bright crown"? Or, "That happened when the shadow fell long"? Would human history itself be remembered differently, less by numbers and more by the rhythms of the arcs? Could whole epics be framed in their glow? Heroes born in the season of silver, wars fought beneath the fading crown? And what about architecture? We've spoken of temples and monuments before, but what of ordinary homes? Would every village align its houses so windows open toward the crown? Could streets curve not by geography but by the angle of the arcs, whole cities built as reflections of the sky? Imagine walking through such a place. Roads bending like light, walls catching silver shadows, doors opening always toward the arcs. Wouldn't even the act of living feel like a ritual? And travel, how different would it feel to walk, to ride, to sail under permanent guidance? The rings fixed above, always marking direction. Would explorers have pushed further sooner, confident that the heavens gave them a compass? Could entire migrations have happened faster, civilizations meeting long before they truly did? And if so, would history itself, our discoveries, our empires, our conflicts, have been rewritten beneath the arcs? I wonder, too, about fear. Today, storms frighten us. Eclipses bewildered our ancestors. If rings glowed above, Would their dimming or brightening cause terror? Imagine a season when dust thickens the arcs, their glow fading. Would prophets rise, crying doom? Would villages whisper that the gods were angry? Could entire wars break out because people believed their crown was dying? And here's a quieter question. Would people closer to the poles, who might barely see the rings, feel left out? Would they make pilgrimages south, journeying across deserts and mountains just to stand beneath the full blaze of the crown? Could the arcs have sparked humanity's first great pilgrimages, long before religion, long before nationhood, simply to see what others saw each night? And how would that shape identity? If you lived where the arcs were faint, would you envy those in the equator? Or would you grow proud, thinking yourself stronger for not needing heaven's glow? Could cultures split along those lines, some calling themselves the crowned, others the bare? But let's think of daily life. Picture a farmer rising at dawn. He doesn't just see the sun. He sees beams breaking through the arcs, strips of light and shade crawling across his field. He plants according to those patterns. His crops lean toward filtered light. His harvests depend on a sky that is not empty but striped. Wouldn't farming itself become an act of reading the heavens, like poetry written in grain and soil? And at night, shepherds watching their flocks would not sit in darkness. The arcs would shine faintly, casting a glow across hills. Wouldn't predators find it harder to hide? Would nights be safer, calmer, less filled with terror? Could humanity have slept more peacefully, dreaming in silver, instead of fearing the dark? And what of art? Imagine a potter shaping clay. Would she carve arcs into her vessels, rings etched like eternal patterns? Would we find ancient shards today, not with stars painted but crowns scratched across them? Would every culture leave behind echoes of the arcs in their crafts, from jewelry to carpets to carvings? Music, too. Do you think chants, hymns, and lullabies would carry longer notes, drawn out like the sweep of the arcs? Would instruments be tuned to echo the steady hum of the crown? Maybe drums would beat in slow, pulsing rhythms, meant to imitate tides shaped by both moon and arcs. Could music itself have grown slower, softer, more meditative, because every note was played under a silver sky? And here's a question I love. Would humans long for darkness? Would poets journey to the poles, seeking skies free of arcs, just to taste the void? Would darkness become rare, sacred, a gift as precious as the glow itself? Could entire monasteries have formed in faraway lands, where monks lived beneath bare skies, claiming enlightenment came only without the crown? And then, consider science again. Would astronomers have seen the stars as clearly, or would ring light drown them? Could the glow have delayed the discovery of galaxies, planets, the vastness beyond? Or perhaps it would have done the opposite, made us hungrier, asking, if our world has a crown, what wonders do other worlds wear? Could we have reached for space earlier, launching ships not in the 20th century but centuries before, compelled by envy of the cosmos? Space travel itself would look different. Imagine rockets piercing the arcs, astronauts drifting through glittering debris, watching the crown from within. Would they describe it as terrifying or holy? Could expeditions into orbit become pilgrimages, journeys not just of science but of spirit? And what of danger? Rings mean debris, constant fragments falling into the atmosphere. Would meteors streak across our skies every night? Could fires be common, forests burning not from lightning but from the rain of the crown? Would humanity fear the arcs as much as it loved them? An eternal beauty that sometimes struck without warning? Here's something else. Would we believe we were alone? Today, the dark sky tempts us to ask about other worlds, other lives. But under rings, would we be too distracted? Would we think Earth alone was adorned, and therefore Earth alone must be special? Could the arcs have slowed our curiosity, keeping us homebound, convinced that no other planet could compare? But maybe not. Maybe the opposite. Maybe rings would push us outward. Imagine early astronomers noticing Saturn through telescopes, its rings echoing ours. Wouldn't that discovery feel like finding a twin in the heavens? Perhaps we'd reach out faster, eager to compare, eager to find out which crown was brighter. and myths, they would multiply endlessly. One culture might say the arcs are ladders for souls. Another might call them scars from a cosmic battle. Another might whisper they are the broken bones of a fallen god. Couldn't you imagine children listening wide-eyed, not caring about truth, only feeling the awe of knowing the sky itself carries a story? But myths fade into history, science grows, and still wonder lingers. Even today, with telescopes explaining Saturn's arcs as ice and dust, we still feel awe. Wouldn't Earth's crown hold the same paradox? Explained, but never diminished? Now let's pause and imagine silence. You're lying in a meadow. Above you, the arcs stretch bright and endless. The air is still, the world asleep. You look up, and for a moment you feel the weight of it, that Earth itself wears a crown and you are small beneath it. What stirs in you then? Pride? Fear? Gratitude? Or something quieter, like the sense of being part of something too vast to name? Maybe that's the greatest gift the rings would give. Not new calendars, not new myths, not new science, but a daily reminder to wonder, to pause, to lift your head, look up, and remember you live on a crowned world. And you, what would you do if tonight, stepping outside, you saw them for the first time? Would you run to tell others? Or would you stand still, whispering thanks into the silver light, letting the question of their meaning settle into your bones? Because maybe, in the end, the rings would not just change Earth. They would change us. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like if the sky carried secrets in plain sight? If every day you looked upward, and there, stretched across the heavens, was a mystery so vast and so constant that it shaped every thought you had? Would it comfort you knowing the crown was always there? Or would it haunt you, a reminder of how little we truly understand? Imagine philosophers in ancient times, lying on stone steps at night. They speak not of invisible forces or unseen atoms, but of the arcs above. One says, the crown is made of fire. Another insists, it is ice, shattered from the stars. Another whispers, it is the breath of the gods. Could you see debates raging for centuries, not over politics or land, but over what the crown is made of? Wouldn't knowledge itself have been a slower, dreamier thing, spun endlessly around those bands? And here's a question. How would we have explained creation? Today, we imagine the universe beginning in fire and expansion. But if rings glowed above us, might we have believed that Earth was born adorned, destined from the start to carry a crown? Could we have thought of ourselves as chosen, special, different from all other worlds? Would that belief have humbled us, or filled us with pride? Think of the philosophers of Greece, who once believed planets were perfect spheres, untouched by flaws. If they had looked up and seen rings above Earth, would they have called them proof of perfection, or scars of imperfection? Would Plato's ideal forms have included arcs? Could Aristotle's prime mover have been imagined as the hand that placed the crown in the heavens? And let's drift to other lands. The Chinese saw dragons in the sky. The Egyptians saw gods sailing in boats of light. The Mayans built temples to the movements of the sun. If rings had arched overhead, would their myths have taken a different path? Would the crown have been woven into every legend? Could pyramids have been built not as stairways to stars, but as mirrors of the arcs, echoing heaven's geometry on earth? And poetry. Oh, what poetry might have been written. Think of Homer. Instead of writing of rosy-fingered dawn, would he have written of dawn beneath the silver crown? Think of Rumi, speaking of love as a flame. Might he have spoken of love as an arc, a circle binding souls as the crown binds the earth? How many metaphors, how many verses, might have turned differently if our sky had always carried its own shimmering lines? Do you think language itself would be different? Would words like halo, crown, circle, carry deeper meanings? Could entire alphabets have been shaped by arcs, their letters curved like the lines of the rings? And then art. Michelangelo painted a ceiling filled with prophets and gods. But if rings had crowned our sky, wouldn't he have painted them too, stretched across the chapel's vault? Wouldn't every cathedral, every mosque, every temple have carried arcs in their designs? Stained glass, marble, gold. all echoing the shape of the heavens. Could art itself have been less experimental, more consistent, as all cultures looked to the same pattern above? But here's a curious thought. Would humans have longed for stars as much? The crown would scatter light, softening darkness. Would the Milky Way be hidden behind its glow? Would galaxies have been invisible, lost in the shimmer? Could our sense of the universe have been smaller, our wonder folded inward instead of reaching outward? If so, how differently might science have grown? Would telescopes have been aimed outward or upward, toward the arcs? Could centuries of astronomy have been devoted not to distant worlds, but to studying the fragments above us? Imagine Copernicus, not writing of Earth circling the sun, but writing of why the crown leans, why it glimmers brighter at certain times. Wouldn't the history of science itself be rewritten under such a sky? And yet, perhaps the rings would not have blinded us but inspired us. Seeing them every night, wouldn't we have asked, do other planets have crowns too? And when telescopes revealed Saturn, wouldn't we have felt kinship, as though meeting a cosmic sibling? Could the rings have united us in curiosity, a reminder that Earth was not alone in being adorned? But rings bring not only beauty, they bring fragility. They are temporary. Dust falls, ice melts, gravity pulls. If Earth had rings, we would know sooner or later they would vanish. Would that knowledge weigh on us? Would poets write endlessly of loss, of a fading crown? Would philosophers ask, what is beauty if it cannot last? Could entire cultures revolve around mourning the slow death of the arcs? Or would we do the opposite? Celebrate them while they lasted? Festivals, dances, songs, laughter under the arcs, joy in knowing we were alive while they still glowed. Wouldn't that give humanity a deeper sense of presence, of living in the moment, knowing the crown was fragile? And what about danger? Fragments falling, meteors streaking through the sky. Wouldn't entire villages burn from time to time? Forests catch fire? Oceans roar with falling stone? Couldn't myths of floods and flames all be born from such disasters? Would we remember the arcs as gifts or as threats? Here's a softer question. How would lovers have spoken under them? Would every promise, every vow, be tied to the arcs? I will love you as long as the crown shines. Wouldn't that feel heavier than our promises now, as though love itself was eternal? And what would children feel, lying in beds while arcs glowed through their windows? Would their dreams be calmer, filled with stairways of light? Or would they fear the arcs dimming, vanishing, leaving the world bare? And let's not forget emotions. How do you think humans would feel day after day, living under a permanent crown? Would awe become routine? Or would it carve us into gentler beings, always reminded of beauty? Could depression be lighter, lifted by the glow? Or might some grow restless, trapped beneath a sky that never truly darkened? Even sleep itself, would it change? Our brains crave cycles of light and dark. With rings glowing faintly every night, would our circadian rhythms shift? Would we dream longer, slower, deeper? Could we live more meditative lives, less hurried, more tuned to twilight than day and night? And what of art today? Photographers, filmmakers, musicians. Imagine cinema under rings. A love story beneath the arcs, a tragedy framed by their fading glow. Imagine symphonies written to mirror their hum, dancers twirling like fragments circling Earth. Wouldn't every art form feel richer, heavier, because the sky itself provided the ultimate muse? But I wonder, would we be content, or would we grow obsessed, forever studying, forever fearing, forever longing to control the crown? Would scientists build machines to preserve the rings, to hold them in place? Could we spend centuries trying to catch fragments before they fell, building technology not for space or medicine, but for saving the arcs? Wouldn't that reshape our entire story of progress? And here is the greatest question of all. If Earth had rings, would we still be the same humans we are now? Or would they have changed us so completely, our myths, our science, our emotions, that we would be unrecognizable? Would we be more united, sharing a single crown above us? Or more divided, fighting over who lives under its brightest glow? Would we be wiser, Humbler, gentler, or prouder? More arrogant, convinced we are chosen? Maybe the rings would not answer those questions, but only deepen them. Maybe that's their true power, not in changing tides or crops or light, but in reminding us that beauty itself is a mystery. So let me ask you one last thing. If tonight, just for a moment, you stepped outside and saw them, glowing across the sky, how would you respond? Would you raise your hands in worship? Would you fall silent? Or would you simply smile, knowing that even questions can be crowns, circling our thoughts like rings around a world? Have you ever wondered what inventions might have been born earlier if the sky itself carried a crown? If every human, from the earliest wanderer to the first city builder, lived under glowing arcs, wouldn't curiosity have bloomed faster? Would telescopes have been made not to search the distant stars, but to examine the fragments of our own crown? Wouldn't science itself have begun with the question of the rings? Imagine a child in some ancient city, staring upward at night. Why do the arcs shimmer? They ask. Parents give myths, priests give rituals, but the child is unsatisfied. So, they take a shard of crystal, peer through it, and suddenly notice details. The arcs are not smooth, but grainy, countless fragments moving in endless circles. Could that moment have been the birth of lenses, centuries earlier than in our world? Would glass have been shaped not for jewelry, but for peering into the crown? And what about mathematics? Would geometry have been discovered not in measuring land or pyramids, but in tracing the arcs of the sky? Perhaps the very idea of a circle, of infinity, of orbit would have come from the sight above. Wouldn't equations have flowed faster, calculations of curves and ellipses drawn not from imagination but from daily observation? Could calculus itself have been born earlier, whispered from the crown as fragments moved in patterns too complex for simple numbers? And think of sailing. Navigation in our world leaned on stars, on Polaris, on constellations. But with rings arcing overhead, sailors would never lose their way. Would that have advanced shipbuilding sooner? Could transoceanic voyages have begun in centuries long before Columbus, long before Zheng He? Might civilizations have met earlier, technology exchanged faster, simply because the crown gave them confidence to travel? Do you think gunpowder, printing, electricity, all those inventions would have unfolded sooner beneath such skies? Or would the crown have distracted us, pulling all attention upward, slowing progress because the heavens themselves seemed enough? And here's something else: astronomy itself. Without rings, we built telescopes and aimed them outward, finding planets, galaxies, the vastness beyond. With rings, might we have spent centuries looking only inward, at the arcs above, never realizing the cosmos was so wide? Could space travel have been delayed, our vision trapped by the beauty of the crown? Or perhaps the opposite. Maybe rockets would have been launched centuries earlier, not to reach the moon, but to touch the arcs, to grasp their fragments, to bring a piece of heaven down to earth. Picture it. Wooden ships replaced by bronze cannons, replaced by steam engines, replaced by rockets. All driven not by war or exploration, but by the desire to touch the arcs. Wouldn't that change everything? Our first step into space, not to explore, but to claim, to preserve, to understand what had always been above us. And what would the first astronauts say, drifting through the arcs themselves? Would they describe it as terrifying, fragments spinning like blades? Or as holy, each particle a pearl in a vast necklace? Would they reach out, try to grasp one, only to see it slip away, orbiting endlessly? Could their words have inspired entire generations? Children dreaming not of Mars or the stars, but of the arcs they had always seen from the ground? And satellites, would they have existed? So much of our technology relies on clear skies, on orbits free of debris. But with rings, wouldn't much of near-Earth space be crowded, dangerous, impossible? Would humanity have learned to launch satellites into narrow bands between the arcs, precision demanded earlier than in our own world? Could that struggle have advanced technology faster, forcing us to solve orbital problems long before we ever tried? And communication, if satellites were harder, would we have leaned more heavily on ground-based signals? Could Earth itself have been wrapped in wires sooner, undersea cables laid earlier, because the sky was too crowded to use? Would our world today be shaped more by connection through the ground than through the air? And what about electricity? Would inventors, watching the arcs glow faintly, have asked if energy could be drawn from them? Could there have been attempts to tap their movement, to harness their pull, to build machines that drew power from the fragments of the crown? Wouldn't that dream linger, the idea of endless energy above us, just out of reach? I wonder, too, about the Industrial Revolution. So much of it was powered by coal, steam, oil. But if rings had been above us, wouldn't we have been reminded daily of fragility? Dust falling, fragments slipping away. Could we have learned sooner to cherish the planet, to search for cleaner energy, to avoid choking the skies that already carried beauty? Or would greed have been greater, the desire to light cities to rival the crown, to build machines that competed with heaven's glow? And here is a darker question. Would war have been different? Would battles have been fought under banners painted with arcs, crowns claimed as symbols of power? Could empires have risen declaring themselves guardians of the crown? Might weapons have been tested not just on Earth but aimed at the sky itself, attempts to control or destroy fragments of the arcs? Can you picture cannons firing upward, crude rockets launched not at enemies but at heaven itself? Wouldn't history be more violent, more desperate, with such beauty tempting us to claim it? But perhaps the opposite. Perhaps rings would have humbled us, reminded daily that we lived beneath something greater, something fragile. Could wars have seemed smaller, greed more pitiful, under a sky that shimmered eternally? Might treaties have been signed under the arcs, promises made not just between nations but between humanity and the crown itself? And what of today? If you stepped outside right now and looked upward, how would technology look beneath the arcs? Cities glowing with electric light, skyscrapers piercing the sky, planes carving trails through the air, but always beneath the arcs, always reminded of heaven's shimmer. Wouldn't architecture be different? Glass towers angled to reflect the arcs, solar panels shaped to catch their shadows, bridges built to echo their curves? Could modern technology itself be more elegant, more graceful, molded by constant imitation of the crown? And space travel, how would it feel to send probes outward, knowing the first step was always through the arcs? Would Voyager, Cassini, James Webb, would they even exist in the same way? Or would our greatest triumphs have been missions not to distant galaxies but to preserve our own crown? Could all of NASA, ESA, Roscosmos have been built first for the purpose of studying, saving, and celebrating Earth's arcs? And here's a thought that lingers. What if they were fading now? What if scientists warned that in 1,000 years, the arcs would be gone, dust falling, fragments slipping into Earth's gravity? How would humanity respond? Would we build machines to replenish them? Would we capture asteroids, break them apart, feed the crown to keep it glowing? Would we spend centuries devoting technology not to expansion but to preservation? Wouldn't that make our entire story different? Not explorers, but gardeners of the sky? And then philosophy, how would thinkers today reflect on technology under the arcs? Would they say, our machines are small, our power is nothing, compared to the eternal crown? Or would they say, we must build machines worthy of the arcs, art and science blending into beauty? Could technology itself have been less utilitarian, more artistic, shaped by a need to echo what we see above? Imagine phones, cars, computers, all built with curves, arcs, rings within rings. Wouldn't daily life look more beautiful, because the crown demanded it? And dreams, what of them? How would children dream of the future, growing up under arcs? Would they imagine not careers in business, medicine, politics, but as keepers of the crown? Would space agencies recruit children not with the promise of Mars, but with the promise of touching the arcs themselves? Would every dreamer grow up with the same thought, someday, I will climb the crown? And you, how would you live differently under such skies? Would you trust technology more or less? Would you feel smaller beneath the arcs, or more inspired to build machines that touch them? Would your curiosity burn brighter, or your humility deepen? Maybe that is the greatest lesson of imagining rings above Earth. Not the science of what they would do, not the politics of how we would use them, but the reminder that technology is always born from wonder. That before rockets, before satellites, before electricity, There was always first the sky, whispering questions into our hearts. And if Earth had a crown, wouldn't that whisper be louder? So perhaps, in the end, the arcs would not just shape our technology. They would shape our dreams of it, reminding us that invention is not just about solving problems, but about reaching upward, answering the mystery that hangs above us, glowing silently, asking, "What will you do with me?" Have you ever thought about how much of human emotion is tied to the sky? The way a sunset makes us pause, the way a storm unsettles us, the way a clear night fills us with longing. Now imagine if above us there were always arcs, glowing, shifting, shimmering across the heavens. How would our inner lives be different if every feeling we carried was lived beneath a crown? Picture grief, a family mourning in silence, gathered under silver arcs. Would sorrow feel smaller, soothed by the soft glow above, as if heaven itself was holding them? Or would it feel heavier, because even in loss, the sky seemed too beautiful, too eternal, mocking the shortness of human life? Could the arcs make grief gentler or sharper? And joy, think of laughter at weddings, feasts, births. Would happiness feel deeper, knowing the crown shared the moment? Couples might stand beneath the arcs and vow, "As long as the crown shines, so will our love." Wouldn't that feel eternal, almost unbreakable? But then, what if the crown faded, dimmed, or vanished? Would promises collapse with it? Could love itself be tied too tightly to something fragile above? And fear. We already fear the dark, the unknown. But under rings, nights would never be fully dark. Would fear lessen? Would fewer tales be told of monsters in shadows, because the arcs soften the night? Or would new fears replace them? Fears of the arcs fading, fears of fragments falling, fears that heaven itself could betray us? What about solitude? Imagine walking alone through fields, the arcs stretching overhead. Would loneliness feel less sharp, because you were never truly alone beneath such beauty? Or would solitude feel greater, as though the crown reminded you of vastness, of how small one person is beneath all that shimmer? And then there is longing. Human beings ache for what they do not have. Today we long for the stars, for galaxies, for what lies beyond. But if arcs glowed above us, would we still long for the distant? Or would our yearning be directed upward, toward something always seen but never touched? Could the greatest human emotion be redefined, not longing for the unknown, but longing for what is visible yet unreachable? Think of children. They already ask why the sky is blue, why the moon glows, why stars twinkle. Under arcs, wouldn't their questions multiply? Why does the crown shine? Who put it there? Can I touch it someday? Wouldn't wonder be constant, stitched into every childhood dream? Could imagination itself burn brighter, because every night was a reminder that the universe was strange and beautiful? And how about dreams themselves? In sleep, the mind wanders, weaving symbols. If the arcs were always overhead, wouldn't they slip into every dream? Stairs leading upward, bridges of light, endless ribbons across the night. Would the human subconscious itself be different, filled with arcs instead of emptiness? Could the collective imagination of our species have grown gentler, softer, more luminous? Now think of philosophy. So many questions we ask about existence, meaning, purpose are born from the silence of the sky. If the crown had always been there, might our questions have changed? Would we have wondered less about why we exist, and more about why the crown exists? Would we see ourselves as separate from it or part of it? Could human identity itself have been reshaped, not as lonely creatures in a vast void, but as beings born under a shared adornment, forever crowned? And then art. Not only paintings or sculptures, but the art of living. Would people walk slower beneath the arcs, savoring the beauty above? Would daily life feel like ceremony, as though every moment was witnessed by the crown? Could even ordinary gestures, cooking, speaking, writing, have carried more grace, shaped by the knowledge that heaven itself was adorned? But what of despair? If the arcs dimmed, if dust scattered, if fragments faded, would people feel abandoned? Would whole cultures fall into melancholy, convinced they had been left behind by the gods? Could despair become larger, heavier, because humanity's crown was fragile? Or would resilience shine brighter? People saying, even if the crown fades, we remain. Could the fading of the arcs teach humanity the hardest lesson of all? That beauty is temporary, and that love, memory, and meaning must be found not in permanence, but in fleeting light? And here's a curious thought. Would ambition burn differently beneath the arcs? Today, we strive to build, to create, to conquer, partly because the sky above us is empty, a challenge to fill. But if the arcs glowed already, might ambition soften? Would we build less, content with beauty given freely? Or would we grow even hungrier, trying to match the crown, to create cities and monuments that rivaled its glow? Would ambition itself split? Some humbled, some driven mad with desire? Think of war. Soldiers marching, drums beating, banners raised. Above them the arcs shimmer. Would battlefields feel different beneath the crown? Would leaders hesitate, ashamed to kill under such beauty? Or would they claim the arcs as justification, saying, we fight for the crown's blessing? Could wars grow fewer or fiercer beneath such a sky? And peace, what of it? Imagine treaties signed under the arcs, hands clasped as silver light spilled across the table. Would peace feel stronger, more sacred, blessed by the heavens? Could the arcs become a symbol not of division, but of unity, reminding us that no matter our land, no matter our nation, we all live beneath the same crown? And then silence. Have you ever sat in silence so deep that it feels alive? Imagine that silence beneath arcs of light. Would meditation be easier, more natural, because the crown itself whispered calm? Would religions have grown less about reaching outward to distant gods, and more about listening inward beneath the arcs? Could prayer itself have been gentler, quieter, shaped by the steady glow above? And death, how would humanity face it under such skies? Would the arcs soften fear, making death feel like a passage upward, a journey onto the crown? Would graves be dug not with sorrow, but with hope, as though each soul would climb the arcs? Could belief in immortality have been stronger, because the heavens carried a visible bridge? But here is a more intimate thought. How would you feel, lying awake at night, watching the arcs through your window? Would your heart ache with longing? Would you whisper secrets to them, as though they were listening? Would they become companions, silent witnesses to every joy, every sorrow, every thought you could not share with another? Would loneliness vanish, or deepen, beneath such constant company? And love, let's linger on love. Imagine lovers walking beneath the arcs, hand in hand. Do you think they would kiss differently, slower, as though every touch was illuminated by the crown? Would love poems fill with references to arcs and crowns, metaphors of endlessness and fragility? Could entire traditions of romance revolve around the arcs, proposals always made beneath them, marriages always vowed in their glow? Would love feel larger, more cosmic, or more fragile, tied to something that could vanish? And children, how would they play beneath the arcs? Would they build games around their glow, chase shadows shaped by the crown, pretend to climb ladders into the sky? Would childhood itself feel more magical, more dreamlike, forever touched by silver light? Perhaps the arcs would not just shape societies, but shape souls. Maybe humanity would grow gentler, more poetic, more contemplative. Or maybe we would grow restless, haunted by beauty we could not hold. Which do you think is truer? Perhaps both. Perhaps beauty always does this, calms us and unsettles us at the same time. And you, how do you imagine your own emotions beneath such skies? Would sadness feel softer, joy brighter, love deeper? Would fear vanish, or would new fears replace it? Would you feel more alive, or more dreamlike, as if life itself was just a story unfolding beneath a painted ceiling? Maybe that is the greatest question the arcs would ask us. Not what we would build, not how the world would change, but how our hearts would shift. Would we carry more wonder, or would we carry more longing? And perhaps, in the end, the arcs would not only crown the earth. They would crown every human heart, shaping not just our world, but our very way of feeling. Have you ever wondered how civilizations might have risen and fallen differently beneath a sky that always carried a crown? Would history look the same, or would every empire, every kingdom, every tribe carry the arcs into their stories, binding their fate to what glowed above them? Picture the earliest villages. Simple huts, fires burning, tools of stone and bone. But above them, rings, shimmering every night. Wouldn't those arcs have felt like proof that their little settlement was chosen? Wouldn't they build their myths around it, naming themselves the people of the crown? And from that seed, would nations have grown with more pride, more certainty, convinced the heavens themselves had blessed their soil? And when cities grew, great and sprawling, wouldn't their rulers look upward and claim the arcs as their own? Imagine kings and queens wearing golden circlets, saying, "Our crowns mirror the crown of the earth." Wouldn't thrones feel heavier, as though authority came not only from power but from the sky itself? Could political power have been unshakable, rooted in the arcs above? But here's a question: what happens when the crown is not visible everywhere? People at the equator would see it clearly, brilliantly. But those near the poles might see only a faint glow, or nothing at all. Wouldn't that divide humanity? The equatorial kingdoms claiming they were favored, while northern and southern peoples were seen as outsiders, denied the full glory of the sky. Wouldn't wars erupt, not for land or wealth, but for the right to live beneath the crown? Could history itself have been written in arcs of conflict? Civilizations rising where the rings shone brightest, falling when dust dimmed them, replaced by new peoples claiming the glow as theirs? Think of Rome. Its legions marched under banners of eagles and laurel wreaths. But if rings arched above them, wouldn't those banners have carried arcs instead? Wouldn't Rome's emperors claim the title not just of Caesar, but of Lord of the Crown? Could the Colosseum have been built with its open roof aligned to the arcs, games and sacrifices made under their glow? And when Rome fell, wouldn't poets mourn not just the empire, but the fading of its crown-lit glory? And Egypt, already a land of gods and monuments, the pyramids reach toward the heavens. But under rings, would they have been shaped differently? Perhaps angled not toward stars, but toward the arcs themselves. Would priests have declared the crown as the stairway for pharaohs, the road into the afterlife? Could Egyptian religion have centered not on the sun alone, but on the marriage of sun and crown, light weaving through arcs like divine fabric? And what of China? Dynasties claiming the mandate of heaven might instead have claimed the mandate of the crown. Dragons painted not among clouds but coiled around the arcs. Emperors enthroned as the keepers of the crown's favor. Would the Great Wall itself have been aligned with the arcs, its endless path mirroring the endless path of fragments above? Think of the Mayans and Aztecs, skilled astronomers, building calendars, watching the sky with precision. If arcs glowed above them, wouldn't their calendars be shaped differently? Would whole cities be laid out to match the tilt of the arcs? Pyramids rising not just as temples, but as earthly reflections of the heavenly crown? Could sacrifices have been made to feed it, blood spilled so the arcs would never fade? And here's another thought. When civilizations fell, would people blame the crown? If the arcs dimmed, if dust shifted and shadows grew longer, would nations see it as a sign? Could droughts and famines be tied not to earthly causes, but to the moods of the crown? Would prophets stand in the streets, shouting that fading arcs meant punishment? Would kings order wars or sacrifices to restore the glow? Could entire ages of collapse be explained not as economics or invasion, but as the ebb and flow of light above? Now imagine the Middle Ages in Europe. Cathedrals rose toward heaven. Stained glass told stories of saints and angels. But with rings glowing overhead, wouldn't every cathedral roof have been open, letting the arcs shine down? Wouldn't priests have pointed upward during sermons, saying, "See, the crown itself testifies to God's power"? Could pilgrimages have been directed not to Jerusalem alone, but to places where the arcs blazed brightest? And think of the Renaissance. Artists seeking beauty, scientists seeking truth. Galileo, Copernicus, Da Vinci. But if arcs filled the sky, would they have studied them first? Would Galileo's telescope point not to Jupiter, but to Earth's own crown? Would Da Vinci sketch not flying machines for the open air, but contraptions to reach the arcs? Could the Renaissance itself have unfolded as a crown-obsessed rebirth, art and science both tethered to the arcs above, and then the Enlightenment with its hunger for reason, philosophers declaring the right of man, the equality of all. But would they still see equality if some lived under brighter arcs than others? Would Voltaire, Locke, Rousseau speak of freedom or of the rights of all crowned peoples? Could revolutions have been fueled not by taxes or kings, but by demands for access to the crown's blessing? And what of colonization? When Europeans crossed oceans, they claimed land, gold, power. But if arcs glowed across the equator, wouldn't they have sailed not for treasure but for light? Would empires have fought not over spices or silver, but over the right to claim territory beneath the brightest arcs? Could Africa, South America, Asia have been seized not just as colonies, but as lands of the crown? Wouldn't that reshape the entire story of empire, history written not in maps of trade routes, but in maps of glow? And industrialization, factories rising, smokestacks darkening skies. Would people have tolerated smog if it dimmed the arcs? Would protests have come sooner, cries for clean air not just for health, but to preserve the beauty above? Could the environmental movement have been born centuries earlier, driven not by science but by longing for an unobstructed crown? Now imagine the 20th century. Wars raging, bombs falling, cities burning. Would the arcs have been silent witnesses, or would they have been pulled into the madness? Propaganda posters might show them, nations claiming the crown for themselves. Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, each insisting their cause was blessed by the arcs. Would bombs dropped under their glow feel heavier, as though heaven itself watched in judgment? And after war, peace, the United Nations formed. Could its emblem have been not a wreath of olive branches, but arcs, a crown encircling the earth? Would peace treaties be signed beneath observatories built to watch the arcs? Could the crown have become the greatest symbol of unity, proof that no matter what divided us, we all lived beneath the same glow? And then the space age, rockets rising, men walking on the moon. But wouldn't the first missions have aimed not outward, but upward into the arcs themselves? Imagine Armstrong stepping not on lunar dust, but on fragments of Earth's crown, saying, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap into the crown of Earth." Would history books read differently, humanity's greatest triumph not in reaching another world, but in finally touching the arcs we had always seen? And today, how would our modern civilizations look beneath arcs? Would skyscrapers mirror them, curving gracefully instead of rising sharp? Would cities at the equator gleam as global capitals, chosen not for trade or geography but for the brightest crown overhead? Could tourism revolve not around monuments or beaches, but around the chance to stand beneath arcs glowing at their peak? And the future, what of it? As civilizations advance, would we try to preserve the crown? Build machines to feed it, capture asteroids to keep it glowing? Would global cooperation form, not for economics or survival, but to protect beauty? Could the arcs themselves be the reason we unite, the shared treasure that binds every nation? Or would we grow restless, as humans always do? Would we try to outshine the arcs, building lights brighter, machines greater, crowns of metal and glass to rival the crown of dust and ice? Would civilizations one day forget the arcs, buried in their own creations? Or would they always remember, always look upward, always let the glow remind them of humility? And you, what do you think? If you lived in a world crowned by arcs, how would you see your civilization? Would you believe it was blessed? Would you feel pride, or fear, or gratitude? Would you march into history convinced the crown was yours? Or would you whisper to your children, "The crown belongs to us all"? Maybe that is the deepest lesson of imagining rings above Earth. Not the science, not the politics, but the reminder that civilizations rise and fall, but beauty remains. That long after empires crumble, long after kings fade, the arcs would still glow silent, eternal, watching. Or perhaps they too would fade, grain by grain, fragment by fragment, until one day the crown was gone. And then history itself would be marked by absence. Every civilization remembered not for what it built, but for what it lost. And perhaps in that loss we would finally understand that beauty is not possession, not power, but a gift. Have you ever thought about what it would feel like to watch something eternal slip away? To look up at the sky, night after night, and notice the crown you thought would last forever beginning to fade, particle by particle, like sand slipping from a broken hourglass? Would humanity weep? Would we rage? Or would we learn to accept impermanence, even when it was written across the heavens? Imagine the first signs. At first, people might not notice. The arcs dim just slightly, shadows growing softer. Farmers who read their fields by ring light sense something is off. Children squint at night, wondering why the glow through their windows feels fainter. Wouldn't rumors begin to spread? The crown is fading. The gods are leaving. The end is near. Which of those whispers would you believe? And then scientists would confirm it. Rings are fragile, temporary. Dust spirals inward, pulled by gravity. Slowly they fall, raining invisible fragments into the atmosphere. Could you imagine the headlines? Our crown is dying. Wouldn't the world hold its breath, suddenly aware that what had always seemed permanent was nothing more than borrowed time? How would cultures respond? Would some deny it, insisting the arcs would never vanish? Would others fall into despair, mourning beauty long before it was gone? Could entire religions arise around the fading, prophets declaring the dimming as prophecy, as warning, as punishment? And artists, wouldn't they rush to capture it? Painters layering silver arcs across canvas, poets writing desperate verses, musicians composing songs filled with longing. Wouldn't humanity suddenly feel the urgency of memory, trying to hold on to what could not be held? Imagine festivals, once celebratory, turning into vigils. Cities gathering at night, candles in hand, watching the arcs fade. Would silence fall heavier than song? Could entire nations unite in mourning, even as others clung to denial? But here's another question. Would humanity try to save them? Scientists might propose grand plans, capturing asteroids, breaking them apart, replenishing the rings. Machines built in orbit to shepherd fragments, to hold them in place. Wouldn't governments argue, some calling it wasteful, others calling it essential? Could wars break out not for resources on Earth, but for control of the fading arcs? Or would we fail? Would every attempt to preserve the crown collapse, leaving us to face the truth? Beauty is fleeting, even when it shines above us. Think of the generations born during this time. Children growing up under dimmer arcs than their parents. Parents pointing upward, saying, "When I was young, the crown was brighter." Wouldn't nostalgia become heavier, every memory colored by loss? Couldn't an entire culture be defined not by what it had, but by what it was losing? And then imagine the final years. The arcs thin, no longer brilliant bands, but faint smudges across the sky. Whole regions that once glowed silver now fall into true darkness for the first time in human history. How would people react stepping outside and seeing a bare night? Would they marvel at stars, newly revealed in full glory, or would they ache for the glow that once was? Wouldn't the first true darkness terrify those who had never known it? And then the day comes, the arcs are gone. The crown has fallen. Earth is bare. Humanity stands beneath an empty sky for the first time in millennia. What then? Would grief consume us? Would poets write endless laments, their words dripping with longing? Would songs turn slow and sorrowful, nations building monuments to what was lost? Could entire cities be abandoned, their purpose gone without the crown above? Or would we adapt? Would humanity, as it always does, find resilience in the void? Would we look outward, beyond our planet, seeking new crowns among the stars? Perhaps Saturn, Neptune, or distant exoplanets would become destinations. Not for resources, not for conquest, but for beauty. Could we become pilgrims of the cosmos, forever chasing rings because we once lived under them? And what about memory? Would children of the future believe the arcs had ever existed? Or would they sound like myths? Once, the earth wore a crown, parents would say. Would the young roll their eyes, thinking it a story, a fairy tale? Would history books carry images of arcs, met with disbelief? Surely, that cannot have been real. Could the fading of the crown blur the line between fact and myth, leaving us unsure of what was true. And you, how would you feel if you were the last generation to see them? Would you count yourself lucky, blessed to witness their final glow? Or would you ache, knowing your children would never see what you had? Would you spend nights awake, memorizing every curve, every shimmer, as though imprinting them into your soul? Here's a deeper thought. Could the loss of the arcs change the human heart? Would we grow harder, convinced that nothing lasts, not even heaven's beauty? Or would we grow softer, cherishing every fleeting moment, because we had learned the truth of impermanence? Could the fading crown reshape our entire philosophy, teaching us to love more deeply, to live more presently, to hold nothing as permanent? Imagine religion in this new era. Prophets once preached that the arcs were eternal. Now they are gone. Would faith collapse or transform? Could new faiths arise, teaching that the crown was never meant to last, that beauty is found in loss? Might temples be built not to worship the arcs, but to remember them, to honor absence as much as presence? And science, what then? Would telescopes turn outward, finally free of the glow, seeing galaxies in clarity? Could the loss of the arcs spark the greatest age of exploration, as humanity sought beauty elsewhere? Would scientists declare, "We lost one crown, but the universe is filled with others"? Think of art again. Would painters, poets, and musicians create endlessly, their works filled with longing? Could entire centuries of culture revolve around nostalgia, a golden age defined not by wealth or power, but by a vanished sky? Would our greatest stories always begin the same way? There was once a crown above the earth, and yet perhaps something gentler would emerge. Without the arcs, people might look more carefully at what remained, the stars, the moon, the Milky Way. Could the absence of one beauty sharpen our appreciation for all others? Might we discover awe not just in grand arcs, but in small details, the curve of a seashell, the shimmer of dew, the fleeting blaze of a sunset? Could the loss of the crown teach us to see crowns everywhere? And what of you? If you stepped outside tonight and the arcs were gone, would you despair? Or would you lift your eyes higher, toward galaxies and stars you had never seen so clearly before? Would the loss of one beauty open the door to countless others? Maybe that is the final lesson of a fading crown, that beauty is never owned, never permanent, but always borrowed. That wonder is not a possession, but a practice. That even when something vanishes, the awe it taught us lingers, shaping how we see everything else. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. Because even if Earth's crown fell, humanity would carry its glow in memory, in story, in art. And perhaps one day, far from here, under another world's rings, we would look upward and whisper, "We have seen this before." And wouldn't that make us feel at home in the cosmos? Have you ever wondered if crowns are not meant for kings and queens alone, but for worlds themselves? That perhaps planets, moons, and stars wear ornaments the way we wear jewelry, not for function but for beauty. And if Earth had once worn such a crown, or might still one day, would it change how we see the universe? Not as a cold expanse, but as a place adorned, alive, dressed in light? Look outward. Saturn's rings, delicate and vast. Uranus, faint arcs tilted at impossible angles. Even Jupiter, with whisper-thin bands barely visible. Doesn't it seem as though nature itself has a fondness for circles, for halos, for crowns? Wouldn't Earth, with its oceans and forests and skies, feel more complete if it too had been given such an ornament? And if so, what does that tell us? That beauty is not rare, but everywhere, if only we notice it. Imagine standing on another world, a moon perhaps, watching Saturn's arcs stretch across half the sky. The sight would silence you, wouldn't it? Now picture looking back at Earth from space. No arcs, a blue marble, fragile and bare. Wouldn't you ache for it to have its own crown, to shine as others do? And if it did, how would we feel about our place in the cosmos? Less ordinary, more chosen, or perhaps more connected, realizing crowns are not rare gifts but shared adornments across the galaxy. And here's a deeper wondering. What if rings themselves are reminders? Not permanent, always fading, always forming, like tides written in dust and light. Could they be the universe's way of teaching impermanence? Not in words, not in books, but in skies? If so, wouldn't Earth's crown, if it had one, have been both a blessing and a lesson? That nothing lasts forever, not even beauty vast enough to circle a world. But would we listen? Humans crave permanence. We carve in stone, write in books, build monuments to defy time. If Earth had arcs, would we have accepted their fragility, or would we have tried endlessly to preserve them? Couldn't you imagine entire civilizations dedicating themselves to holding the crown together, machines orbiting endlessly, feeding the arcs with dust and ice, as though humanity had taken on the role of jeweler to the earth? Wouldn't that make us both noble and foolish, guardians of something too grand to ever truly keep? And yet, maybe the rings were never meant to last. Maybe crowns are only ever borrowed, never owned. Wouldn't that make their beauty sharper, more piercing? To know that every glance upward was a gift, every shimmer temporary, every glow fleeting? Isn't that what makes sunsets, autumn leaves, blossoms in spring so powerful? That they will not stay? Couldn't the same be true of a crown in the sky? And what of other civilizations beyond Earth, beyond us? If life exists elsewhere on worlds with arcs, wouldn't they too build their myths, their sciences, their songs around them? Wouldn't they too stand in awe, asking the same questions we ask? And doesn't that mean that beauty itself is universal, binding not just humans, not just Earth, but life across the cosmos? Can you imagine one day humanity traveling to such worlds, standing side by side with beings unlike us, pointing upward and smiling at the same arcs? Wouldn't that moment erase distance, erase difference, showing that awe is the truest language? And yet, even without a crown, don't we already have this? The Milky Way, spilling across the sky like a river of stars. The moon, pulling our seas, glowing with borrowed light. The auroras, curtains of green and violet, dancing at the poles. Haven't we always lived beneath crowns, just not the ones we first imagined? Could it be that Earth's true crown is not dust and ice, but wonder itself? Think of your own life. How many times have you lifted your eyes, caught by beauty you cannot explain? A rainbow after rain, a comet streaking across the sky, the first star at dusk. Haven't those moments crowned your heart, just as surely as arcs could crown the earth? Do we really need rings, when beauty is already scattered everywhere, waiting to be noticed? But here's the gentle paradox. Imagining them changes us. Even if Earth never wore a crown, the act of picturing it, silver arcs, glowing nights, shadows stretched across seas, shapes our hearts. Isn't that the gift of imagination? That by wondering what if, we step into new ways of feeling, new ways of seeing? So maybe the true crown is not above us, but within us. Not dust and ice circling a world, but questions circling a mind. Every what if a fragment, every dream another arc, until our thoughts themselves form rings around us, crowning us, adorning us, making us something more than we were. And doesn't that feel right? That Earth may not have rings, but humans do. Circles of wonder, curiosity, longing, questions that orbit endlessly, fragile yet luminous? Couldn't it be that the universe gave us not a physical crown, but an inner one, carried not by planets but by hearts? Now imagine this: you step outside tonight. The sky is dark, stars glittering. There are no arcs, and yet, because you've imagined them, you see them. Faint lines in your mind's eye, stretching across the heavens. You smile because even in their absence they exist, in memory, in thought, in dream. Doesn't that mean the crown was always here, whether or not Earth ever wore it? And you, how will you carry it? Will you tell stories of it, paint it, dream it, whisper it to children before sleep? Will you let the imagined arcs remind you of impermanence, of wonder, of beauty borrowed and beauty lost? Will you wear them quietly in your own heart, a crown of imagination no one can take? Maybe that is the final gift of this thought experiment. Not proof, not certainty, but a crown of questions. What if Earth had rings like Saturn? What would it mean? How would we change? And though we may never know, haven't we already changed simply by asking? So perhaps the Earth does not need rings at all. Perhaps the act of imagining them has crowned us already. And isn't that enough?